And we are back on the Zero Hour. This is Richard RJ Eskow, and we've heard a lot during the presidential campaign and also in our daily lives about big pharma, about drug companies and their impact on our lives, the impact of pharmaceuticals and human life takes many forms in many walks of life. Here to talk about one of them now with us is Annette Gaudino. Annette is the project co-director or the co-director of the HCV, the Hep C vaccine project at the Treatment Action Group, which was she was formerly a statewide coordinator for the Campaign for New York Health. She is a longtime activist in this area. She spent 4 years with ACT UP in New York and has many years of direct action organizing experience in the HIV/AIDS, LGBT, women's and harm reduction movement. So, Annette, first of all, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard. I'm looking forward to talking to you and to your listeners.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and obviously very serious subject, but you guys recently released a report called Dying at These Prices, Generic HCV Cure Denied. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That TAG, the Treatment Action Group, does in collaboration with Doctors of the World. Their French acronym is MDM, Médecins du Monde. And together with MDM, we created an online platform called MapCrowd, which allows collaborators from around the world to put in data. It's kind of like a wiki, to put data in about treatment access in their countries, what drugs are approved and available there, what the prices are, what about generic drugs, are they available, where are they in the pipeline, how many people have accessed treatment so far, what's the overall disease burden. It's basically a way to measure progress and to hold governments and other stakeholders accountable to see how we're progressing towards eliminating hepatitis C, which we can and should do because unlike many other chronic diseases, we have a cure.
So tell us then what you found. So you basically crowdsourced globally along with the French group, Médecins du Monde, and tell us what you found in this study.
So one of the things I want to give a little bit of background, just so that people may not know a lot about Hep C. Hep C's been in the news a lot because of the recent drugs that have come on the market, which we all know are exorbitantly expensive. But just to give your listeners some ideas, about 3.5 million people are living with hepatitis C in the U.S. And right now, hepatitis C is killing, well, actually since 2007, hepatitis C has killed more Americans each year than HIV. It's the deadliest infectious disease that we have going right now. And deaths, unlike with HIV, deaths continue to rise. We had over 19,000 Americans die in 2014 of hepatitis C-related diseases, a lot of it having to do with liver cancer, and that's according to the CDC. And we also know that if left untreated, Hep C can progress towards cirrhosis, and of those people living with Hep C who get cirrhosis, there's a 20% chance that they're going to develop liver cancer. So this is a disease that is kind of a silent killer. It's not really on a lot of people's radar, and it leads to disability, lifelong disability, and it can lead to death if left untreated. So we have these cures. And what we've found, looking at the data worldwide, is that, treatment access and treatment uptake varies very, very widely. You have a situation in a country like Egypt where 22% of the people are Hep C infected, which is really shocking, right? Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that in the 60s and the 70s, they had these widespread vaccine programs, which were really great. But unintended consequences, people were reusing needles, and unfortunately, a huge cohort of people have been treated. Their government has recognized there's a problem. They are actively treating people. To give you another example, we have a country like China, which has a huge disease burden. Something like 18% of the country is infected with Hep C, but treatment uptake so far, only 0.5% of the infected population has been treated. Very, very low numbers. They don't really have a lot of awareness. There's a lot of stigma. And in the U.S., there is stigma related to Hep C because Hep C, for the most part, is associated with drug use, injection drug use. It's also associated to a certain extent with sort of like the 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And we do know that there's a cohort of people born between 1945 and 1965 these are the people that the CDC recommends should get tested for Hep C that do bear most of the burden. But there was a recent study that found, and actually not all of that is due to, in fact, most of it isn't due to sex, drugs, and rock and roll and the 60s. In fact, a lot of it is due, just like in the Egyptian case, to people who got vaccinated in the 40s and the 50s when they were kids, the time before we had plastic disposable needles, when there were, glass syringes and metal syringes that were sterilized and reused, and they just weren't sterilized properly. And so a lot of people got infected as children. It's interesting to me that, all just like HIV, there's stigma associated with Hep C. The stigma is always sex and drug related, right? Because those are things in America that we have a hard time with. We're very puritanical about those things. But even in the case of Hep C, when you look a little bit further, you find that actually the real causes of this epidemic were actually preventable and somewhat unavoidable, and it's just something that happened, and it's one of those things that we try to highlight in our report, that we kind of need to decouple morality from public health and look at public health as something that's evidence-based, something that we can, make rational choices about and, move forward in terms of dealing with some of the public health challenges that we have.
So what, you mentioned, Annette Gaudino, that of the Treatment Action Group, that there is an undertreatment problem globally. And it seems in some ways, certainly stigma is part of that. What are some of the other factors you found in your report? Where does, for example, drug pricing come in?
Drug pricing comes in huge. It's a huge problem. As you know, these drugs are very, very expensive in the U.S. and abroad. In places where countries and national governments have taken a stand and tried to get access to generic drugs, prices have fallen precipitously. India has been a real leader globally in this movement, in this fight. They've been doing it for 20 years now and started with the HIV drugs. Basically, they took a look at the new direct-acting antivirals. That's what we call these new drugs that can cure Hep C, and took a look at the science behind them and said, you know what, there's nothing novel here. These are basically antivirals, just like the antivirals that are used to fight HIV, antiretrovirals in that case, and say Tamiflu. And there's nothing, this is just applying known science to a new disease. We're not going to recognize any patents for this. Immediately upon the Indian Supreme Court ruling that they weren't going to recognize patents for Sofosbuvir in this case, Sovaldi, the very famous drug from Gilead, and other like similar drugs, suddenly Gilead ran to the table and negotiated a voluntary licensing agreement with about 90 countries. I think now it's increased to 101 countries to provide the drug, in most cases to those countries, for $900 for the full course, the full 7 weeks, 84 pills, which is something that they had, their recommended manufacturer's price for it initially in the U.S. was $84,000, $1,000 a pill.
So let's back up a second. This is like that's like hold the phone here stuff, right? I mean, Annette Gaudino, we're talking about. You said three things in a row, which I just want listeners to just they're mentally latch onto. Okay, one is that these pharmaceuticals that are being used to treat this life-threatening disease and for which we are being charged an enormous sum of money, the value of a house in many parts of the United States, that there's and the Indian courts found that there was nothing novel there, so they're really charging a fortune for what's not a new invention. Number one, just a new application of older science, and number two, once they said, you don't really deserve a patent for this, which is a big deal too. All of a sudden they said, well, we could actually give it to you for $900. And
that's better than zero.
Which is better than zero, multiplied by all the people who have this disease.
150 million across the world globally.
Yeah, so that's not nothing. And number three, but here in the United States, we're still paying $84,000 for this $900 course of treatment, right?
So let me clarify this a little bit.
Sure.
$84,000 was the manufacturer's list price. When you go and buy a car, nobody pays the sticker price, right? It's also true in the U.S. that except for really early goings, no one is paying that sticker price. Most insurance companies and most payers are paying about half that. That's one of the reasons they priced it at $84,000, because they know that some discounts eventually will work it in. As we know, I mean, we knew this as advocates because we've known this for 30 years. Pharmaceutical companies lie, but it took Congress, or the Senate, I should say, months, and I think 150,000 pages, including emails, hundreds of emails from Gilead executives to executives discussing this, that they basically pull these numbers out of thin air. They're actually documented.
Else, but
somewhere else, exactly. I know we're
we're on the air. I got it.
and we know that they basically had an internal discussion. They were looking at pricing at anywhere between $50,000 and $150,000. The company they purchased it from, they made an $11 billion investment to purchase the technology from another company. They were going to price it at $36,000 for the full course. Gilead said, well, let's, we put some money into this, anywhere between $50,000 and $150,000 for the full course. They knew north of $100,000 that the insurance companies might push back. And so they said, you know what, we'll split the difference. How about $84,000 a pill? That's a nice round number. We have on record the CEO saying that this price has nothing to do with the R&D. We also know from public filings that in addition to about $270 million that Pharmasset, the originating company, invested in researching and developing this drug, and about $880 million that Gilead spent on the phase 2 and the phase 3 clinical trials, getting it to market. So it's a little north of $1 billion, in order to get this drug to market. But like I said, they paid $11 billion for the company based on future projections, based on knowing that they're aiming to make 40, 50, 60 billion dollars off this drug, right? That's their game plan. And, there was a recent study that came out in the British Medical Journal that looked at not only the effect of this kind of, merger and acquisition style of research and development on drug development, on driving prices higher, but it also looked at how the financialization of the whole process. So not only are they using mergers and acquisitions as opposed to science to develop drugs, but they're also hoarding cash. It's kind of like Apple, right? They want to keep their stockholders happy. They want their price to keep going up. They know as they cure people, the price is going to go down because the revenue is going down. So they actually aren't reinvesting a lot of money into research and development. They're hoarding cash, just like Apple, right? They're sitting on a ton of cash so they can pay dividends, so they can, look good on their balance sheets. So the notion, the myth that we need to grant monopolies to private entities, private corporations, and protect their profits and give them billions of dollars in profits because that's what's required in exchange for them to give us life-saving medicines. It's, we were always suspicious of it. We were getting more and more evidence that it wasn't true, and now we're starting to see the final nails in the coffin of that argument. It just doesn't hold any water.
Right, because what you're really describing, Annette Gaudino, is it's more like speculation, like the banks do.
Absolutely. That's exactly the word. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, if you multiply 900 times 1,500,000 sufferers at $900, they'd still make a huge fortune on this.
That's exactly right.
It's not like they're hurting. So I just want to summarize again for our listeners, because what you said was, they will sell this for $900 a treatment course, but instead they said out of thin air or somewhere else, we could charge 100 or 150,000, but we'll get pushback. So we'll make up the number 84,000 for something that could otherwise cost $900, and then we'll let them cut it in half, like selling a car. My manager's in a good mood, and you can get the shiny undercoating, and we'll give it to you for 42,000. But it's still something they would sell for $900. And by the way, I'm just doing it in my head, so I could be wrong, but I think $135 billion off of this thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, it gets even better in terms of the pricing, because one of the things we see is that once you let generics out into the market, capitalism starts to do its thing, right? And that's the thing that's so interesting about these corporations. They love the rules of capitalism except when they don't, right?
Right.
So when you allow competition in and you start to see mass production of generic versions of these drugs going out into a lot of different countries, you also start to see their competitors get into the marketplace and have different variations on the same theme, different ways of curing the same disease. There was a researcher, Dr. Andrew Hill from the UK, who did a study in which he found that generic producers could actually produce the full course of treatment, right, for hepatitis C, in particular sofosbuvir and azacitidine, two drugs that combined together work, right, for $62 and $14 U.S. respectively. Put that together, right? That's what, $76, and that includes a 50% profit margin. So you could be making this drug for $76 and making a profit and getting it out to people, right?
So unfortunately, and that's a mind-boggling revelation, right. And yet, unfortunately, we're gonna run out of time. So, what can people do? I mean, this is outrageous stuff. What can people do to learn more about it and maybe get involved?
I invite people to take a look at mapcrowd.org. There's a ton of information there. We want to get collaborators. We want people looking at the data and sharing the data. Our report is available there for free. Please spread it wide and far. Mapcrowd.org. It includes a lot of interesting information about the U.S. and especially about the prison system that unfortunately I didn't get a chance to talk to a lot about. But read up, get educated, and look to your elected officials. Look at who you're putting in office. Do they support monopolistic drug pricing, right? Do they support legislation that's going to let, for example, Medicare Part D negotiate drug prices? Are they supporting looking at the U.S. Patent Office and maybe reforming our patent laws? What about R&D transparency? Is there a bill in your state legislature that's looking at R&D transparency? There's at least a dozen states who are looking at that stuff.
Okay, Annette, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to say there's so much to this topic. Come back and we'll talk more about solutions and broader stuff.
That sounds great.
Okay, let's do that because we've laid the groundwork now. Now let's talk about solutions. So we will have you back very, very soon. Annette Gaudino is HCV Project Co-Director for the Treatment Action Group. Thanks for beginning this conversation on pharmaceuticals, and we will continue. And thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, Richard.